Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's session of the Leadership Series talk. I'm very privileged and honored that we have Dr. Rajat Kathuria with us today for the talk. Dr. Rajat Kathuria is presently the Dean of School of Humanities and Social Sciences. He brings with him 3 decades of experience of teaching and research. Dr. Kathuria was the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relation before joining SNU. He has worked with a number of organizations, including World Bank, International Labour Organizations, and many such organizations, giving his feedback on the policy on international trade and other things. I must say that in terms of economic policies, Dr. Kathuria holds a very strong foundation and has been advising many of the important organizations across the world on such issues. Dr. Kathuria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rajiv. Am I audible? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Rajiv, so much, and good morning, students, faculty, both in the room and outside. After that warm introduction, I hope I can live up to what Rajiv has just said. I'm going to speak on markets and technology, and the primary question that I'm going to ask in this talk is whether we need a sort of a new way of looking at markets in the age of digital technology and digital platforms. And that's the fundamental question. It's also a research question. It's a complex question. So before I get into the sort of details of how technology is altering the way markets function, I mean, because some of you might be being introduced to the subject for the first time, let me say a little bit about how markets work in general, and then talk about how technology has altered the way markets function and whether we need a new approach to look at markets. Right? That's the fundamental question that I'm going to ask in this talk, and whether we need to regulate the markets differently. Of course, we know from our experience, both in markets domestically and international markets, we know that we need to regulate markets. And what does regulation mean? Regulation means that government comes in and directs the allocation of resources in markets in a particular direction. And whether we need to relook or rethink that function of the government regulation when we have digital markets. Now, digital markets, digital platforms, you're all familiar with, right? I mean, can I take off this mask? That's better, yeah. We're all familiar with digital markets and so on. Apple, Amazon, Google, Alphabet, these are emerging technology giants. And they alter the functioning of markets, right? I mean, that's what they're doing. They're providing services, but they've also altered the functioning of markets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for regulation of such markets, and whether we are equipped, whether governments across the world and in India are actually equipped to deal with this situation. Of course, I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Talk a little bit about the digitization of platforms. We've had platforms before in the brick and mortar space. Think about newspapers, right? Newspapers were like platforms. They already existed. They were intermediaries. They were, on one side you had suppliers of content, on the other side you had buyers of content, and they were intermediaries. Think of platforms as digital counterparts. Of course, content by newspapers is also available digitally, but today so much more is available digitally. And what does that mean to us? What are the challenges and what is institutional design? Some of these are sort of evolving issues. There's no sort of specific way to do them. When you think about economics, when you think about regulation, and you think about institutions, it's very different compared to the way you think about laboratory experiments. I mean, the world is a laboratory, or the region, or Dadri could be a laboratory, if you will, and things would happen differently. People react differently to stimulus. People react differently to incentives, to carrots and to stick, right? It's not a controlled sort of experiment. So anything could happen, right? So we need to understand whether technology has altered markets in a way that government needs to come in and direct differently compared to what it's doing, it has been doing in the past. Of course, just like markets are imperfect, governments are imperfect, right? And there is no sort of gainsaying the fact that there are imperfections all around. So we have to try and find, okay, what's the best way to get around these problems? So that's what I'm going to talk about. As I said, happy to take questions at the end. Let me just very quickly, I'll give you some examples, some sort of day-to-day examples that you might be familiar with or experienced. Let me put them into the context of markets and functioning of markets. You know, when economists think about markets and competition, they say that, look, competition is the best, perfect competition is the best. If you deviate from perfect competition, now perfect competition is so much stylized, it's so much in the textbook, large number of sellers, large number of buyers, homogeneous products, nobody having the ability to influence price, nobody having the influence over other things that are happening in the market. And you know, it's a very specialized textbook market. Any deviation from that means that there is what economists call market failure. The fact that you have a monopoly, and the classic example of a monopoly where, you know, the first example of a digital monopoly that began to abuse its market power was somebody like Microsoft, Mr. Bill Gates, Microsoft. That is a classic example that happened in the 80s. And what did Microsoft do? Microsoft was selling Windows Explorer. This is the first case. Of course, IBM cases, I'll talk a little bit about them later on in the session. But the celebrated case of abuse of monopoly power and therefore of market failure occurred in the 1980s, 88, where the District Court of Washington declared that Microsoft had abused its market power. And how had it abused its market power? Once economists say market power, it means that you've deviated from the norms of perfect competition, and therefore there is some sort of market failure that exists. And it may call for intervention, it may not call for intervention, but in this case, the intervention was they stopped Microsoft from bundling Internet Explorer and the Windows operating system. Now, you know bundling, right? Buy one, get one free, buy a car, I'll give you insurance free. There are so many types of bundling. And there are economists on both sides of the spectrum. Bundling is bad. You know, what's wrong with bundling? It reduces your search costs. If you're getting something bundled along with the product you are buying, your search costs go down. And you know, nowadays, I mean, just as a deviation or a digression, search costs are high, especially when you experience large number of choices. A consumer tends to get confused. And if somebody else is making the decision for you, I'm going to bundle this, maybe your search costs are going down, and maybe therefore that's good for you. You have to make less decisions, you've got to spend less time. But on the other side of the spectrum is the fact that you're abusing your market power by bundling. You know, in one market you have power, which is the Windows operating system, and you're forcing consumers to buy Internet Explorer, which is come bundled. Now, you know, you will give all sorts of arguments in court. You'll give arguments like, look, if I extricate Internet Explorer from the Windows operating system, the Windows operating system will not operate as well or as efficiently. So it's actually not a bundle. It's actually one product, or what Bill Gates said in court, it is a pure bundle. It cannot be separated. So, you know, you're making decisions, regulators, governments are making decisions, and sometimes these are complex decisions. You know, how many of people in government, and I've worked so often with government and with regulators and with, you know, bureaucrats, how many times will they know the technicalities of the product that is being sold? And in the digital world, this becomes million times more complex. In fact, the complexity goes through the roof. So, I mean, you have to understand what am I doing and when should I be doing it. But the fact that Microsoft abused its market power is clear, because it told hardware manufacturers, if you sell the hardware without the Windows operating system, I'm not going to do business with you, or what is called refusal to deal. If I refuse to deal with somebody, and if you do economics and if you do management, you will come across many such cases where I mean, look at retailers. If retailers say, I'm going to stock a rival product, if the retailer has power, then the retailer will say, look, I don't want to stock your product. You know, those kinds of issues. And Microsoft, because it had 90% market share of the Windows operating system, refused to deal with hardware manufacturers. So obviously people complied with Microsoft and they said, okay, we'll do business with you, rather than doing business with alternative software provider. This is the first celebrated case of abuse of markets and getting into the interface between markets and technology. What you should take away from here is that technology makes markets a little complex. The functioning of markets little complex, but it is, as I said, there is a monopoly power and I need to control it, and how do I control it? So monopoly means that there is a market failure. The second reason for, and the third and the fourth reason, I'm not going to spend too much time because this is what I want to focus on, because most of the tech companies today have very high market shares and therefore they have very high market power. The moment you have high market shares, it means you have market power and therefore the possibility, the capacity to abuse the market. Right? And that's what I'm going to focus on. The rest of the reasons for market failures, like public goods, the most famous example of a public good in a textbook is defense services. You know, who will provide defense? It's the government that provides defense, because I can't price defense because they're non-excludable, non-rival, etc. I don't want to get into the technical details, but think of a public good like street lighting. You know, private sector will find it very difficult to recover the costs of street lighting and therefore it's a public good. Roads, I mean, I have private participation in roads, but there are tolls now. So private sector could, you know, build roads, they do build roads, but I have to give them the ability to charge toll, etc. Second, there are externalities. Externalities are pollution. You know, there could be, education is a positive externality, pollution is a negative externality. What that means is the private sector will produce too much of pollution and you've got to restrict the private sector from producing pollution, and there you have taxes, you have sort of quotas on limits or on emissions, etc. And the last reason for market failure, which is also what I'm going to focus on, is something called asymmetric information. When you're selling a used car, this is the most famous example in textbooks again. You know, Akerlof in 1970 in Delhi wrote an article of market for lemons. A lemon is a bad used car, but the seller knows the quality of the car, the buyer doesn't. When you're buying health insurance, you know the quality of your health and the insurer doesn't. So there's sort of asymmetric information between the buyer and the seller. There is no incentive for you to reveal the true condition of your health. The insurance company tries to get that information through signals. You know, where do you live? Are you married? Do you have children? Do you drive a car? Have you had accidents? And, you know, all kinds of questions. But there is no incentive for individuals to reveal information. Managers about firms when they're issuing IPOs, for example. Now, of course, the SEBI and Securities Exchange Commission come down very heavily on misrepresenting or concealing information, but you can think about why managers will not find it in their interest to reveal information about their firms. If you do accounting, you know how many accounts the business keeps. They keep so many accounts, one for the public, one for the government, and one for themselves internally. So the incentive to reveal information is less. So all these reasons are there for, you know, government to come in and say, okay, let me try and regulate, create a SEBI so that the market can be regulated, firms can be forced to reveal information, otherwise they are censured or penalized. And asymmetric information is sort of pervasive. It's all over the place. And how to deal. Sometimes the market will find a solution on its own. That's the beauty of markets, right? As we say, bazaar. The beauty of market is sometimes it finds its own solution. And you don't have to intervene. Like in a second-hand car market, now you have instances where there are intermediaries, that say give warranty, and warranty is a signal for reducing the information deficit between the seller and the buyer. So there are sort of mechanisms where the market will find solutions on its own, and there are times when the market will not find solutions on its own. So this is, you know, in a sense, this is the theory of markets and market failure where government intervenes. This is the framework that you should keep in mind for the rest of the talk. One more thing I want to say is that, you know, a lot of the planning in India, the existence of the Planning Commission, and, you know, in Russia, during the time of Glasnost, if you remember, you were not born then, most of you were not born. Glasnost happened in the late 80s. And, you know, you don't know, Mr. Gorbachev sent some of his planners to London and said, look, I want to become more sort of friendly with markets. Russia wants to open up. They have already started their political opening up, which was called perestroika, and then they wanted to do glasnost. So he said, okay, let me send some you know, planners, erstwhile planners in Russia, what to produce, how to produce, you know, how much to produce, was all decided by, I mean, I'm talking about the USSR, was all decided by the planners and not by the markets. I mean, these are fundamental questions that the market answers, and the allocation of resources, etc. These are fundamental to what a market does. So he said, okay, let me see how markets work. He sent his planners to London, and these guys were sort of planners who were moving around the London market. They were walking on Oxford Street and Bond Street and on the pavements. There were shops there. There were fruit sellers and vegetable sellers on the pavements, the large pavements. If you've been to London on Oxford Street, they were all there. And the planners, they found no sort of shortages or queues, long queues to buy breads and eggs as they were familiar or they were accustomed to in the USSR. And so they saw all this, and then when they went back for a meeting with their sort of counterparts, they were not planners but their sort of economic policy makers in London or in the UK, they asked a very fundamental question. They said, how is this happening? How are the markets clearing? Why are there no queues? Why are there no shortages? Why are there no surpluses? Because in USSR there were both shortages and surpluses, because no man, no computer on this planet in economies can exactly decide for the moment, for the short term, for the medium term, for the long term, how much you need to produce and who will buy it, what the supply is going to be, what the demand is going to be. So they asked this fundamental question of their planners, of their counterparts in the UK, how is this happening? Can you please tell us? This is like magic. And the people in United Kingdom were stumped. They said, what do you mean? We don't do this. We do none of this. This happens. You know, how does it happen? Well, it just happens. Because Adam Smith's markets, the invisible hand, of course, the invisible hand is not all perfect, and I'm going to, which is what I've been trying to explain, but it happens. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty, so much wheat, so much bread, so much eggs, so much meat, and so much of this, and so many houses to be built, so much of investment need to be. These are decisions that happen by themselves. They happen on the profit motive. They happen on whatever motive, the objective function, but they happen. And there is no need to micromanage markets. And this thinking to the Russians now in the USSR, it didn't go down because they were not used to it. They had to make all these decisions for the short, medium, long term on how much a collective farm would produce, who would buy it, and who would keep it, some inventory, and how much of investments to be made. So this is, this is not an easy question, but markets answer this question all the time, every point in the day. The fact that you've come to Shiv Nadar or you're studying here means you've allocated your resources in a particular way. And nobody's told you to do that. You've decided this on your own, right? And that's the beauty of the market. While the market is a great institution, it is also a flawed institution because it leads to all kinds of problems. And I think in the modern world, the problems of markets has been huge inequalities, right? And you know that. capitalism and huge inequalities. You know, the debate in the United States, 99-1. I mean, the median pay, some of you who do management, the median pay of the median pay in a corporate, which was about 50 times or 60 times or 90 times the CEO's pay was 50 to 90 times the median pay. Today it is now 3,000 times the median pay. Now you tell me, is this market failure? Or are you going to get into regulating CEO salaries and options and compensation? It seems bizarre that it is 3,000 times, but the question is the regulator's time well spent in trying to regulate it? I asked this question of a Nobel Prize winner who had come to Delhi visiting my previous institution. His name is Michael Spence, who works on labor markets, and I asked him this question. And his response was, well, it's a problem, it's a concern, but I'm not sure what regulation or fixation of salaries of top private sector corporations could do. Of course, in public sector, I don't know if you've seen the series Yes, Prime Minister, and they are trying to fix the pay of public sector, and Sir Humphrey gives the recommendation. He chooses the CEO salary of the highest paid executive from IBM and Apple and presents it to whoever the committee and says, well, look how underpaid we are as bureaucrats, and the pay. So you can, of course, that's a sampling bias, but Yes, Prime Minister, a series sort of gives you an indication, at least these examples give you an indication, that sometimes markets are not sort of working the way you want them to work, but it's not clear what the solution is going to be. And with digitization or digitalization, this problem compounds, as I said, many-fold more, which is what I'm going to try and sort of encourage you to think about. I'll skip this, but essentially I've said this, market competition is very good for everybody. Competition is good for me as a consumer. But, if you look at me here, and I'm standing here speaking to you as, an economist, not as the dean, hopefully, but speaking to you as an economist, I won't like competition for my job, right? Nobody likes competition. No firm likes competition. No individual likes competition. But for the consumer, competition is great because it allows you to receive goods at lower prices. And keep this in mind, because when I talk about the Chicago School a little later, which is sort of exemplified by two great people, I mean many great people, but two of the 1950s. One is Robert Bork, who was a lawyer, and he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox, and I encourage you to read that book because intellectually it's a very stimulating text. And of course George Stigler, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, who talked about pricing. And their hypothesis was at that time that, look, if you're getting lower prices, it's good for the consumer, consumer welfare increases, consumer surplus increases, why bother, right? If Reliance is giving you data at 10 rupees for 50 MB or 5 rupees for 200 MB, all of that, what's the problem? It's good for you. We didn't think at that time of questions whether how it would affect the competitors, and the competitors would be debt-ridden and unable to compete, with one of them getting out of the market, almost threatening to get out of the market, something called predatory pricing, right? So, but the Bork hypothesis or the Stigler sort of theory of price was consumer welfare. As long as consumer welfare is being served, don't worry, markets will find ways to correct themselves. The Schumpeterian hypothesis of creative destruction would prevail, which is, even if company X has market power today, there will be startups coming in, there will be small companies coming in that will disrupt the market and will make competition reach an equilibrium where competition will come back and give you good prices and add to consumer welfare. No firm or no sort of entity will be able to sustain market power for a long period of time, because the beauty of markets is that it will eliminate this competition. That's Bork for you, the antitrust, Robert Bork. He's had a disproportionate impact on the legal profession of, markets, of how markets are regulated, disproportionate. And in fact, the United States is laissez-faire to a large extent because of the Chicago school led by Bork of market regulation. Regulation is bad. It does more damage than it does good, because consumers, as long as they're getting good prices, what's the point? If it's not broke, don't fix it. And that was Bork, that was Stigler. But remember, that was before this is the 60s and 70s. This is when there were brick and mortar markets. These were not technology markets. So the question we are asking, or at least I'm posing, I don't have the answer to it. In fact, economists really don't have, or anybody doesn't have an answer to this question, what should we do with markets in the era of technology or digitization? We don't have answers to, we don't know. But the question I'm asking is that do you need to relook at? And many years ago, when outsourcing was beginning to happen, let me digress a little bit. When outsourcing was beginning to happen, there was an outcry in the United States. You must have heard of the theory of comparative advantage. International trade, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, including to Michael Porter, who's talked about competitive advantage instead of comparative advantage. From Adam Smith to Michael Porter, the idea of comparative advantage has developed, and a lot of international trade used to happen on the basis of comparative advantage. If I'm better at producing labor-intensive products, if China is good at producing labor-intensive products, then China becomes the factory of the world, and if I'm good at outsourcing, I become the back office of the world. HCL is a great example of how India has become the back office of the world, and this is what is called outsourcing. Now, the question that three famous economists asked, and no mean economists, these are all Nobel material, Bhagwati, Srinivasan, Panagaria. A paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I encourage you to read it, The Muddles Over Outsourcing. The fundamental question they asked was, do you need to relook, or do you need to devise a new idea, because outsourcing, because of the outcry against outsourcing that emerged in the United States, you know what outsourcing is. Now today we're talking about insourcing, reshoring or insourcing. But outsourcing, when it happened, there was an outcry in the United States. And why was there an outcry in the United States? The outcry was simply because they were losing jobs. And that was the fundamental premise. So Bhagwati, Srinivasan, Panagaria. Bhagwati, of course, teaches at Columbia. Srinivasan, unfortunately, is no more. He taught at Yale. Panagaria teaches at Columbia. He was at our Planning Commission of the Niti Aayog, my own teacher in the University of Maryland. High regard for him. They said, look, you don't need a new, sort of just because the US is losing jobs because of outsourcing, but the economics remains the same. The economics doesn't change. The fact that when you open your laptop and you find that parts are made in 100 countries, can you believe it? 100 countries. And they're all assembled, maybe in China, maybe hopefully future in India. But they're made in 100 different countries because I'm outsourcing, not service, this is manufacturing. There's been tremendous development in logistics, in containerization, as Paul Krugman, another Nobel laureate, calls it. Containerization revolutionized electronic production because components were now produced in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Taiwan, in China, in Japan, in Korea, shipped, aggregated, and assembled in China. 100 different countries. Apple, gets returns on intellectual property, which is obviously the highest, 40%. The rest is shared between these countries. But China has scale. These countries have scale, which India doesn't, but I'm digressing. But the point is, the economics of international trade and comparative advantage doesn't change. Right? That's the point. This is a sort of digression into the field of trade, but it doesn't change. So if you now come back here to technology and markets, does it change? And as I said, I don't have the answer. But there could be views on either side of the spectrum. Some people would say, yes, it does change. Some people would say, it doesn't change. But let me give you an idea about how India has approached markets. Again, Bhagwati, who who was in the Planning Commission in the 1960s, and you can talk to your parents. This is a great, joke that in his book called Planning for Industrialization, which is written by, along with his partner and wife, Bhagwati and Desai, Jagdish Bhagwati, Padma Desai. Padma Desai is a sociologist by training, but of course, eminent scholar. He wrote in his book that he was attending one day a conference in the Planning Commission in New Delhi in the 1960s. And I don't know how many of you are aware of, people work on files, right? There's a green note, and since I worked in the government, I sort of understand. They work on files and write notes to secretary, to the prime minister, to the economic minister, or the Ministry of Finance, economic advisor. They all work on files. What have you written? So records are maintained. Again, something that we've sort of borrowed and kept on from the British, or the British has moved on. And he was attending this meeting in the Planning Commission, and the question was, should we open up our markets or make them, let them remain closed? Remember, at that time, India had a 400% tariff, well, it was there till 1991, on non-essential, what is called non-essential products, powder and lipstick, and I'm choosing these words deliberately because they appear in Mr. Bhagwati's quote. On consumer goods. You remember this obsession, we'll import capital goods, we'll import, computer software, we'll import computer hardware, but we won't import computer chips. We won't import potato chips. So, go for computer chips, but not potato chips was the byline in the 80s and 90s. In the 60s, of course, there were no computer chips, but there was this lipstick and powder. So here's this man who's obligated to write on files and take decisions on behalf of the government with complete sort of seriousness. He's saying, and I'm quoting Bhagwati, with zeal and passion, he argues for maintaining the markets closed, because if we open up the markets, we are going to waste our resources on Brill cream and powder, while I could not help smelling Brill cream in his hair. This is Professor Bhagwati sitting next to that person who's taking a decision. He's using Brill cream, but he doesn't want to open up the markets for non-essential goods because he feels that would not be good for India. And it's completely serious. What is the underlying sort of idea, very powerful idea? And Bhagwati is saying, like, you don't trust the market. And our inability to trust markets meant that we had this calibration of what we should open up, what we should not open up. We should not open up to potato chips, and if KFC is doing badly and their flies, we'll throw them out. Coke was thrown out in the 70s, remember? George Fernandez was the industries minister. Coke went, Caltex went, Esso went, they all went back. IBM went. They all were in India in the 70s, and they all had to go back because of the foreign exchange laws. But that's history. But the fundamental premise was the planners did not think highly of the market. Of course, after 91, all this has changed. Why did they not think highly of the market? Because they thought it would lead to misallocation of resources. You will spend too much on non-essential things, and we as a country are not ready for it yet in the 60s and 70s. A paternalistic view of markets, right? That's, I know what's good for you, but you don't know what's good for you. It's a very paternalistic view of markets, or inability to trust the markets, right? That's where we are coming from as a country. We are emerging from, Nehruvian sort of idea of the commanding heights of the economy being owned by the public sector. And they are still, some of them are still are, but we know that public sector is also prone to a lot of inefficiencies because the incentives in the public sector are very different from the incentives in the private sector. But that's another debate. But I wanted to give you a flavor of how markets function and how they don't, and what we think in India, what we've thought of markets. It's a very sort of high helicopter view, but it's a true view. That's what we were emerged from as a mixed economy, as a socialist economy. Okay, I'll come back to this. Let me not, I mean, when I talk about remedies, I'll come back to the breakup of AT&T, a natural monopoly. But and I've also already said this, so let me just mention it. Why do we get into regulation of markets? We get into regulations of markets because one of the ideas I have already shared with you is this idea of sort of inequalities. You want to get the distribution right. Balanced growth, go to rural areas, I will give you subsidies, I'll give you tax holidays, I'll create a special economic zone, I'll create a special export zone, etc. Not very far from here, Kundli was one such zone. There are so many special economic zones in India. China is a country that has developed on the basis of economic zones and along the coast, and on town and village enterprises which were given fair amount of flexibility in doing what they wish to do. And there are some fascinating stories about China's development. There are cities in China that produce buttons only. That's it. There are cities that produce only labels. Your labels made, whoever, I don't want to name any brands, but whatever, labels. The cities. They are producing only cigarette lighters. There are cities producing. This is scale. This is scale. It's not. You can't become the factory of the world without doing such things. So you read Paul Krugman writing about this. Fascinating. The economics of geography. It's very good. So distribution, getting the distribution right. Why do you regulate markets? To ensure that there's no abuse of markets, to ensure that information between the buyers and sellers is sort of similar, to foster economic competition, to get consumers, to look after consumers' interest. I worked in a regulator, and the prime sort of idea when we were working was, a prime objective was consumer interest, not only short term but long term. And there's a sort of nuanced difference between what short-term interest and what long-term interest is. I've already given you an example of telecom where the short-term interest may not be coincident with the long-term interest, right? I mean, in the long term, prices could go up. If Vodafone exits, then prices could. So that's the long-term interest. So foster competition, ensure that there is competition in the market, right? So that's sort of goals of regulation. Okay. Let me cut to the chase now. So hopefully you've got an idea of what markets are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do. So somewhere in the, there was a dot-com boost, there was a dot-com boom in the 90s, which coincided with, President Clinton's administration from 92 to 2000. There was a huge dot-com boom, overcapacity in cables across the world. Under the Pacific, you had it, under the Atlantic, you had cables running from Europe to America, and there was huge excess capacity. A telephone call from India to America would cost less, not price, cost less than a telephone call from India to Delhi to Kathmandu, simply because, I mean, it's counterintuitive, but the capacity of your cables running under the sea from India to the United States was much more, and therefore the costs were lower than your call from India to, let's say, Nepal or Bangladesh or the Southeast, right? Huge overcapacity in telecom markets, which led to sort of the boom later on in digitization. Of course, technology also progressed, but it's very counterintuitive for a country that had, most of the time, that had geographical pricing and distance-based pricing of telephone calls. This is something that was quite counterintuitive and takes your mind some amount of sort of focusing on it to understand that this could happen. And it happens in many markets. In railways, probably doesn't happen, but in airlines, it does happen. Delhi-Bombay is cheaper than probably Delhi-Srinagar, right? Because there are probably 60, 70 flights a day going to and from Bombay. So it's the supply side, right? I mean, the marginal cost is much lower. But, sometime in the sort of 2000s, you got this OTT, over-the-counter boom that happened. And this has done wonderful things to the market. OTT has done WhatsApp, OTT. And think what WhatsApp has done to the telecom market. It's just sort of disrupted the market. Because if I'm Bharti or Airtel, and I've paid thousands of crores or hundreds of crores at license fee because you allow me to price a call from Delhi to United States or Delhi to Bombay, and I can charge for SMS messages. I've bid on the basis of that. And here come WhatsApp or Skype or Viber, all these OTT players, and say, I'm going to give this to you free. Your SMS is free. Who does SMS today? You know, I remember one SMS when I was in TRAI, I worked in TRAI for a while. One SMS cost 5 rupees. One. And today, there's no price for an SMS. You do WhatsApp all that. In fact, WhatsApp has become like a verb now, like Zoom. Let's Zoom. Let's WhatsApp. I mean, advertisers are telling you, WhatsApp me on this. Or sellers are telling you, Zoom. This is my Zoom address. So, it's of course the lexicon has changed, but if you think about what it's done to markets, it's disrupted market. The first thing that people do is go to the regulator and say, boss, isko band kar do. Close down WhatsApp, close down Viber, or make them pay a license fee that we have. Now, what do? There are legitimate requests from both sides. I am a technology disruptor of the Schumpeterian variety. I have come in as a startup and I have boomed and I'm offering these services. And there are millions like me. Of course, WhatsApp is an example, but there are millions like me starting from garages, just like Bill Gates did, just like Apple did. Steve Jobs started from a garage and developed. There are so many, you'll learn in management, which is very famous, is that failure is the route to success. There are so many that fail, and then one succeeds. For every WhatsApp that has succeeded, there are probably many more that have failed. And that's what markets do. And that's what I've been saying. That is the beauty of markets. But they disrupt markets. And technology, what is different from technology startups today, that from the brick and mortar system, these markets are two-sided or multi-sided. Right? They have a supplier, they have a buyer, they are the intermediaries in between. And they are able to address many of the problems that I've talked about, especially the asymmetric information problem. Remember, you rate an Uber driver, but the Uber driver also rates you. Right? If you read Hal Varian, who's Hal Varian, those of you who are doing economics must be studying his textbook called Intermediate Microeconomics, or at a higher level microeconomic analysis. At least he was the one we used to read when I went to grad school. Hal Varian was the chief economist of Google until several years ago, and I had invited him to Delhi to give a talk, and he came and he talked. And he's also in the sort of Stigler mold or the Bork mold. Don't interfere with markets. Let markets function. And the idea being that these markets, with Google, these technology markets is making it easy for information now to be available. And I'm giving you just an example, but so many other kinds of information that was concealed, not available, but digitization allows that information to be available. But it also creates a problem on the other side. There is too much information that is available. 90% of the data that is generated today because of your sensors, your IoTs, and simply purchase decisions, buying decisions online, 90% of that data is unused. Only 10% of that data is being used, and there are lots of problems that have emerged, problems with democracy, subverting of democracy, subverting of the markets, etc. But they're also helping markets function better because information is now available on both sides of the market. And they also create the other issue, and this is the major sort of issue that digital markets create. Before going to the sort of major issue that I want to talk about, let me also say a couple of other things about technology and markets, is that they have a tendency, if you understand what the sort of word externalities mean or network effects mean, and network effects are pervasive in all of technology, which means that why did, sort of going back to the previous example, why did Microsoft become big?
when it came in as Windows operating system. DOS sort of collapsed and Microsoft emerged. Why did Microsoft emerge as a big player? How could it have 90% of the market worldwide on the operating system market? The idea of network externalities, which is you have Microsoft Word, I have Microsoft Word, Windows, and it makes sense for all of us to have Microsoft Word because then we can exchange documents and interoperability becomes possible. That's what is called network effects, right? And these network effects are pervasive in in digital markets. Why does Apple become the dominant player operating system in a section of the market? Why does Google become dominant? Why does Amazon become dominant? These are because there are profound network effects here and therefore size. And this is something that regulators across the world are grappling with. How do I address this? And a lot of people are saying that ex ante, prophylactic interventions in markets or ex ante, I'll stop them from doing that. Remember I said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. What's the problem that these are created? Yes, Google has 90% of the market. Is it creating a problem? And people say, yes, it is creating a problem. But let's understand why it's becoming the way it is. It's successful because of these, what economists call network effects. Let me give you an idea so that you can appreciate it as students or somebody who's not been exposed to these ideas of externalities or network effects. Remember when you guys were growing up or you were in school, I remember at least my son, he used to read Harry Potter, and we used to ask him, why are you reading Harry Potter? Why are you reading? Well, he said, all my friends are reading Harry Potter, so I decided to read Harry Potter as well. And then it becomes a group. Everybody's talking about Harry Potter and they're talking about the characters there and they're talking about the actors, everybody. Why? Because these are the network effects that are being created. And you can think of network effects being created in technology markets which are profoundly more important, but also profoundly more destructive of the functioning of markets. And there have been history of fines that have been imposed. What in the United States you call them what? Cease and desist. And you look at the history of United States litigation in technology markets. IBM, cease and desist from exploiting your market power in the mainframe space. I don't know if any of you know the mainframes. And mainframe. If a bank has a mainframe in its bank and it wants to move out to another system, let's say somebody else comes out of the other system, the switching costs are huge. Think about, why go to the 80s? Think about number portability. When you want to switch out of number portability, both the guy who's going to relieve you, your operator is going to ask 100 kinds of give me this, give me that, So there are switching costs. And once you get caught in to a particular technology, once you get locked in, as the term goes, it becomes difficult to switch out of it. The history of litigation in Europe has been much more interventionist. I'll give you an example of how interventionist, let's say, Europe has been. They fined $45 million on one of these companies, I think it was Google, because it said that they were not giving enough room for consumers making choice. Now, they were forcing consumers to accept their conditions. Now, Google said, look, I'm not. You go to my first page, and I've got a consent from the consumer, and the consumer has said, I agree. But the court said, 45 page of legalese or 20 page of legalese, at the end of the document in fine print, and at this end it says, I agree because I have to move on to the next page to do whatever I'm trying to do. That consent is not worth the paper it has been written on. So actually you have not taken consent of the consumer, and therefore the regulator fined Google. What do you pay? What do consumers pay with today when the services are free? By the way, as Milton Friedman said, there's no free lunch. So don't be fooled by this idea, buy one, get one free. Is they're doing it for a cause, or they're doing it because of the goodness of their heart, or some selflessness. They're doing it because they're getting something in return for you, either now or in the or later. There's no free lunch. This is another Nobel laureate, Milton Friedman, saying that there is no free lunch. So you're paying with your data. Of course, the world is now sort of thinking about how data, personal, non-personal, and that's my last slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But these markets have become big because of profound network effects. There's huge amounts of data is being generated. And of course, surveillance is a problem. There's a book called Surveillance Capitalism that has been written. I'm forgetting the author, but there is a book. Of course, you know all those exposures that were made by that famous man in the United States when all this thing was happening. I'm forgetting the name of, I have one of those senior moments. But these technology-based markets create massive problems for regulators. And on one side, people say that, if it's not broke, don't fix it. These prophylactic or ex ante interventions or preventive interventions are not going to solve the problem. And one of those interventions I was going to talk about is the AT&T intervention that was made. I'll come back to that. But let me sort of try and make this sort of in a framework that is sort of understandable in common parlance, which is that if you put these 5 big firms together today, Amazon, Google, or Alphabet, Apple, Facebook, and there's one more, right? And Netflix. There's another one. Anyway, sorry? Amazon, right? I mean, that's the same. I'm talking about global Walmart. But there are 5. They call them the big 5. So if you put them together by market cap, right? Market cap is, of course, not like the GDP, but market cap is, of course, much larger than the GDP. But if you put them together by market cap, they will be the 5th largest country in the world today. Right? 5th largest country. Facebook, no, not Facebook. Google buys a company a month since 2017. And this is what I wanted to say. So you've heard of the Chicago Robert Bork Stigler view, let me say Bork view. Don't enter into markets because there will be some innovator that will come and will dislodge the incumbent so that you don't need to worry about how markets are going to function. I mean, this has been the US view, and I will give you a sort of a 50,000 feet view in a moment. The other view is, of course, the European view, which says intervene, let's try and nip this in the bud. But these companies become huge. They are worth trillions of dollars. And they create what Raghuram Rajan, Louis Gonzalez, these are these sort of Chicago, again, this is coming from Chicago, so it's sort of ironical that the view that is coming from Chicago today, at least one view, is saying, I think we need to do something, because what these companies are doing is that they are buying up innovators or creating what is called a kill zone. And once you have kill zones, which you know what a kill zone is, IBM did this for years. There was a competition that came in, startup, you bought it out. What did you do? You prevented an innovator because it challenged your position in the market, and you're creating a kill zone. You are stopping innovation from progressing. And if that is true, then you need to do something about it. These kill zones are not good for consumers in the long run. But are they doing it? Sure, they're doing it. I mean, nobody, as I said, likes competition. Facebook is doing it. Apple is doing it. They spent $30 billion in 2017. This is the EU report on conglomerization. You know what conglomerates are? Conglomerates are companies that diversify into unrelated markets. So they are buying not only digital companies, they are buying small companies that are non-digital as well. Okay, I sort of, as an aside, I'll come back and talk about this in a minute. But this is the major problem in market functioning, because one of the ways that markets are supposed to function in the Schumpeterian sort of mold or Schumpeterian sort of premise is that they would come in, incumbents would be challenged, and they will be unseated. Uneasy is the head that wears the crown, and the crown is being worn by these people, and challengers would come. But today, what they're doing is they are destroying, or they are acquiring and keeping competition at bay. Is this good? I don't know. And that's the challenge. Are these kill zone good? Because you talk to some startups and say, gee, I want to be acquired. I'm getting $1 billion for being acquired. I'm happy being acquired. But some people may not be happy being acquired, but yet they're acquired because you can't stand up to an Amazon. If you read Hina Khan, who's written a book, written a paper in the Yale economic papers, interesting paper, Hina Khan, just like Bork called his book The Antitrust Paradox, Hina Khan calls her paper in the Yale papers, economic reviews, or Yale Antitrust Review, she calls her paper The Amazon Paradox. There are people in the Financial Times, Rana Faruhar, who writes on technology every week in the Financial Times, and they are sort of attacking these companies. Every day of the week, these companies are being attacked. But there are others who say, and these are all seasoned people, all well-respected people. Sometimes they talk about the economic dominance, sometimes they talk about their political dominance, influencing markets, not only influencing markets, but influencing outcomes of elections, subverting democracy. They are there, they are in your face every minute of the day. You're doing something that is affecting you. You don't know it, but it's the amount of data that is being created. Some of it is very good, don't get me wrong, some of it is great. You're driving on a road, there are traffic jams, so you collect that data, that's sort of non-personal data, collect that data, and okay, I need to do something about the way the traffic moves, either create new roads or try and divert the traffic some way. So that lots of that data is being used, or big data is being used for the benefit of traffic movements, for the benefit of urbanization, etc. A lot of non-personal data is being used to correct for potholes, crowdsourcing is happening, etc. All that's great use of data, but that's non-personal data. How would you, I've been subjected to this, and I'm sure all of you have been subjected to this. You buy a product online, and next moment on your Gmail or whatever you're opening, you get an advertisement for the same product or a related product. I mean, this is customization to the nth degree. And you order an Uber or an Ola from point A to point B multiple number of times, and your friend standing next to you orders the same cab, the same company, you get different prices. Price discrimination. Is that good? I'm going exactly the same distance. I'm going to the same place. It's from a different phone. It's from a different person. You're being charged differently. I mean, we've heard of first-degree price discrimination in economics, but you also heard of legal positions which says you can discriminate between consumers provided you are not discriminating between a category that is arbitrary. So you can create a category, students. You create a category of students, give them a discount. Historically, that's what's happened. But within the category of students, if you discriminate to every individual, it becomes what economists call first-degree price discrimination, i.e. auctions. So I walk into a store with a sticker on my head, this is the amount that I'm willing to pay for it. And I'm taking all the consumer surplus away from you. That's what these algorithms are doing. They're trying to identify what is the maximum amount of price that you are willing to pay for a particular commodity or a service or a good. Is that good? I don't know. I'm throwing these questions. Maybe somebody say, gee, you can't allow that. How will you regulate it? How are you going to do it? Of course, it's become easier to identify these problems. Antitrust economists have had a field day working in this area, because every time you scan a good in a supermarket, it goes to, you have an inventory database. You can see exactly what price is being charged, what time of the day, who's buying it, etc. You have all that information. The number of antitrust cases against grocery stores in the United States have multiplied after RFID technology came into existence. Antitrust, which means resale price maintenance, selling discriminatory, not selling something, top shelf Kellogg's, bottom shelf Post, all those issues of abusing your market power. Because management people say, eye contact on a grocery store makes me more likely to buy that product than the other product. Lots of cases. But RFID came in, lots of price abuse was discovered so it allows us to, discover abuse much easier. Technology allows it. But it also makes the existence of such abuse more, as I've given you examples, and there are thousands and thousands of examples. So as I said, I don't have, so innovation, the killing of innovation, buying off companies and putting them on the back burner, putting that technology on the back burner, charging different prices to different sets of customers, etc. All of this is happening, but because these are, I'll just come to you. I'm going to conclude in a minute, so I'll take all your questions. So these are the challenges for regulation, the amount of data, as I said, but technology has certainly distorted, well, let me not say distorted, that's the wrong word to use as an economist. They have disrupted markets. And because it has disrupted markets, it has disrupted politics, it has disrupted the interface between politics and economics, but it's not clear to anybody today in the world how to regulate these markets, these data markets, these digital markets. And I'll conclude by a very, as I said, 50,000 feet story about how this is sort of affecting the geopolitics of the world that we live in. Some international relations or strategic professors or students here would find this story very interesting. One of the reasons why Mr. Trump engaged in a trade war with China, one of the reasons, is that there were lots of arguments that were being made in the United States. I may not be as coherent, but I'm trying to put two strands of arguments together. One is the dominance in digital platforms or digital technology and artificial intelligence of the United States. That's a given, right? That's a given. They have dominated and they continue to dominate it, but China is emerging as a threat. United States, and all these companies are based in the United States. You know that. And a lot of interventionist rhetoric is happening in the United States. Cut them, structural, like AT&T was broken up in the 1980s. It had become too big. AT&T was broken up into what is called the 9 baby bells. That is a structural remedy of markets. I'll cut you down to size so that you can't abuse the market anymore. I don't know whether structural remedies are good. If you break Facebook or you break Google, how long-lasting will that solution be? But think about it. I'm not going to spend too much time. But I want to go to this major point because I think it's important to recognize the signs of our times, which is that in order to maintain its dominance in artificial intelligence and technology, and with China saying in the 13th five-year plan that I want to become the leader for innovation and technology in the world. That's the sort of central feature of China's 13th five-year plan. Mr. Trump said, look, you are developing all of this on the basis of the technology that has been produced in the United States. You have stolen our intellectual property and you're building your technology and artificial dominance, artificial intelligence dominance on the back of technology without paying for it because you've stolen our technology. I mean, by and large, give me poetic license to say this very quickly. Of course, there are nuances here. And therefore, he's imposed restrictions and started the trade war with China to corner China. That's one view. Companies in the United States argued, and this is the breakup story that I want to relate to. So you put these two arguments together, saying that if you don't allow us, China, what is the feedstock for artificial intelligence? The feedstock for artificial intelligence is data. Data has become cheap, storage has become cheap, algorithms have become more powerful. And that's the reason for data becoming dominant today. China allows its companies access to all data, and we don't know how, but it allows it, and therefore, if it's the feedstock for AI, China has already stolen a march on the United States. Taking this argument to the regulators in the United States, the Big Five said, look, if you want us to become dominant, if you want America to remain dominant in technology, you have to sort of look the other way when we get access to data and begin to use that data. And begin to use that data means abuse the data, right? If we use this data, you have to allow us to do that, because without that, we are not going to be able to maintain our technological and digital supremacy of the world. And that's very important. And there is a lot of truth in this argument. And that's the reason these companies are arguing for a much more laissez-faire attitude. But I think when water goes over your head or reaches your nose or your neck, you begin to, if they continue to abuse their dominance, the regulators have to do something, or at least be seen to be doing something in consumer interest. You can't allow them continues to use your data without being accountable for it. And this is the genesis, if you will, of a trade war between the United States and China. And the United States is really worried about China's emerging supremacy in technology and in artificial intelligence. And this is, we haven't heard the end of the story. The story is still playing out. But it is true that we don't know what's happening inside China and how they have access to all of the data, but we know that they do have access to the data. Can India, Mr. Modi keeps saying, why don't we produce a Google like China has? China has produced those whatever, Bing, I don't know what those companies are, not Bing, but they've created Baidu, etc., at home behind the walls of protection. I don't know whether it's too late for India to do that now, to do it on the back of protection or a protected market, or do it on the basis of an open market and likely would see the emergence of a tech giant within India. It could still happen without protection. But China has used the mode of protection, the route of protection, to have sort of these giants emerge. We can do it on the basis of open markets as well. But as I said, I don't know where we're going. But technology and digital markets clearly have sort of changed the way we think about markets and changed the way we have to react to them. But regulating should be, I may sound like a sort of free market person, and I am. Regulating should be a sort of an option, but if you know what is going to happen, regulatory impact assessment, if you know that this is what you do. But of course, there's much more to this, but I think I've taken enough time. I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention. Questions? I'm happy to take questions. Yes, please go ahead.
Actually, you understood many things, but unfortunately, we understood the challenges, but we are unable to understand what are the limiting factors or controlling factors of those challenges. You understood
Yeah.
Outsourcing, open markets, expanding your markets, and export-oriented. So many things you are understood, but at least I just want to only ask one main question.
Yes.
For example, your generations, like a first generation, second generation, third generation, like technology improvements happens. If the person is going to the fifth generation, and if the new technology coming in sixth generation, how the fifth generation person can return back their investments? Because this new generation always kick out the old generations.
Okay. I think you've heard of legacy costs, right?
Yes, sir.
So there are lots of legacy costs. Regulators also, if you ask this question of Robert Bork, the name I mentioned, you ask this question of Robert Bork, he'll say, and you ask a management professor this question, what do you say? It's a risk. It's a business risk that you've taken, right? You've taken a business risk. My job is to protect competition, not to protect a competitor. You say, I am pro-market or whether I'm pro-business. What would you say? Are you pro-business or are you pro-market?
It's a difficult question to answer.
No. This is a simple question. Are you pro-business or are you pro-market?
Market mostly.
You're absolutely. I'm pro-market. But I don't want to support business. I don't want to support a particular entity. Raghuram Rajan, when he was chief economic advisor and later governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he has famously remarked that the success of American business has been on the basis of an open market, on the basis of innovation. The success of Indian business has been its proximity with the government.
Sir, those things are accepted for the developed economies, sir. But our is a developing economy. How you kick out the low level people and with the high technologies, how these normal people can sustain, how the normal people can sustain, sir.
I'm not saying inequality is not a problem. What I'm saying, or what everybody is saying, is the market, if the market is failing and it's producing inequality, as you're referring to, is it an answer, is the answer to have everything under public ownership? Right? That's one answer, right? I'll create, Mr. Nehru said, public sector is not there to make money, it's there to create employment. So one of the public sector roles. But when you have two policy objectives, you always, you'll never be able to satisfy even one. The point is, I'm not making the point of the point I'm making is that would supporting a particular business address that problem? Or are you going to only enrich one business and create a national champion as they've done in China? This is the story. Should I create a national champion in India?
So, no, sir, the question is, if I became a policy maker, example, so how I can protect both? That is the question actually.
If you can answer that question, then you should be sitting there. Because, no, I'm not joking. Equity, efficiency, according to economists, if you're going to meet efficiency objectives, you probably compromise equity, right? Today we are having in Scotland in a few weeks, there will be a climate summit called COP26. People are arguing from developed countries, I can achieve green growth. I can grow, and I can grow in a sustainable manner, i.e. the goals of growth and sustainability can work together. You talk to Indians here, and you say, is solar going to be enough, or do we have to use coal? If we use coal, then we are still going to pollute, but we need coal to grow. So growth may be sustainable for the solar, but growth certainly is not going to be sustainable if you use coal. Is the United States going to help us to develop more technology in solar and storage, or are we going to live with coal? i.e., is the trade-off between sustainability and growth dead, as it is, they say, in the case of US and Europe, although I don't think it is. In the case of India, it's certainly not dead. We have to choose between sustainability and growth. The more you grow, the more you will pollute until you have green technologies. So what's the answer? I don't know. Environment is a luxury good. You begin to demand an environment, you demand a clean capital, when Mr. Clinton comes or Mr. Trump comes, you clean up, and all the slums get driven to the background, right? You want to present a very nice view to everybody who's coming. But you can't wish that away. That's the reality of our country. Environment becomes a luxury good. When your incomes grow, you begin to demand there. Of course, I'm sort of making a caricature of this to enable you to understand. Of course, I do want that we should grow in a sustainable manner, but you can't wish under the carpet the realities of India. You cannot. And the question that you ask, can't we do it? You know, I've taught for long enough, and students just like you come up to me and say, gee, sir, why can't we clean the garbage? And, oh no, what's so difficult about it? I say, wait for a few years, get into the job, and you'll realize the idealism you have is great. It's noble, and it should be there. But the real world sometimes throws challenges that one is not able to address immediately, right? So equity and efficiency are challenges. Yes?
Sir, when Britishers came to India, all GDP was almost one-third of the total world at that time. And after that, it totally collapsed. So is this a market failure or state-sponsored kill zone, sir?
Well, Shashi Tharoor has given a very good talk on this on YouTube, and I think he has, I'm not a historian, but there are as many views on this as there are people writing on this. But I think it's very easy, I mean, it's a legacy, it's always easy to question the past, right, and point holes at what the past, but I think what you as a student, how can we help, because you are just like, your name? Krishna. Just like Krishna, I think you want to have some idealism and say, okay, let's look to the future. The past has happened, and I think there are lessons of history, and as they famously say that if you don't learn the lessons from history, you're apt to repeat them, or you're condemned to repeat them. Yes, that's true. But I think this is a little sterile now, whether the British caused a lot of the problem. It's not untrue, as I've given you examples also. Working in government is still pretty much rooted in the yes prime minister mold, which is what the British did, and we continue to do it while they've moved on. Right? But if you look to the future, I think markets is something that we have to embrace. And as I asked Krishna, Mr. Modi, when he came to power, minimum government, maximum governance, right? And what does that really mean? That really means that government should use and the private sector should increase, but the role of the private sector, maximum governance, regulation, govern to regulate. That's what Mr. Modi was attempting to say. Minimum government, maximum governance, maximum let the private sector, but the private sector are no angels. You know that, right? We know that, and I can tell you, in my next talk, I can tell you several stories about how private sector has no angels. But if you regulate well, then they'll do it. So I think we look to the future. There are many faults, but I think I will be pro-market rather than pro-business, but with governance, with regulation. And it's very difficult to find the right kind of regulators anywhere in the world, especially in this space. And that can be the topic of another sort of talk, is how do you find the right people who have the capacity to be able to regulate these markets. Our own sort of founders of Shiv Nadar University are in the complex space of digital technology. Do you think any regulator who's going to regulate either this market will have the same knowledge as the software engineers or the technicians or the skilled personnel that HCL has or any other company has or Reliance has? No way. They won't have that expertise. So in foreign countries, in the US and UK, they get people on secondments. Okay, I'll get you to come and depute with the private sector, with the public sector, and attract them with high pay packets and get them to the government. As Mr. Modi is saying, lateral entry. Yes, lateral entry. That's very good because generalists will find it very difficult to regulate these complex markets. You know, algorithms. Mr. Sundar Pichai, when he was at Congress, they asked him, what is inside those algorithms? And Mr. Sundar, I don't know. I don't know what is it. I don't know how this algorithm is functioning. If he doesn't know, how the algorithm is functioning, then, how will you and I know how the algorithm is functioning? So it's a complex market. It's very, very complex. Yeah.
Talking about the Big Five that you mentioned, the only solution the US Congress or anyone is seeking is to break them into pieces. But if we look at the history about the General Electric, the company that was there, they break it down, but indirectly means those broken down pieces again grow up into a big giant. So will not history will repeat itself and
Yes. That's exactly the worry that, when AT&T was broken up into 9 baby bells, there was this company called Bell Atlantic that was created, and Verizon today is the product, and Verizon today is as big, if not bigger, than what AT&T was. And that's exactly what I said, that in digital markets, if you break up companies because of network effects, profound network effects, willy-nilly over a period of time, the company will become big. And so some people say that, breaking up is good in the short run because it gives a signal. What is the sort of rationale for law or having, let's say, is Shiv Nadar a non-smoking campus? Is Shiv Nadar a non-smoking campus, right? Or all universities are, right? Rajiv has answered my question. That doesn't mean you throw the law out. It's there as some form of deterrence that maybe it will work. And some penal action once in a while would work as a public good for the others. So I may not do it. Right? It doesn't mean just because it's not working, you don't say I'm not going to have the law. Right? We know that, there are companies that have been built on finding loopholes in the law and growing, right? So law has a deterrence effect, and I think that should continue to be there, and structural remedies. But I think a much better, I haven't given you a solution for, as Krishna was saying, because I don't have a solution, but one solution could be, in economics, there are carrots and sticks, right? There are incentives, and without incentives, nothing works. Carrots for being good. If you eat your vegetables, I will give you ice cream, right? That's a very good way of telling your child to eat vegetables, right? I'll give you ice cream. That's a carrot. A stick, if you do this, then you will be fined, right? The third approach is sort of managerial approach or behavioral approach, which people are beginning to talk about, knowing the futility, not the futility or the limitations of both these sort of carrots and the sticks. And the third approach is coming up, which is known as, it's very nascent in its, because these technology-driven markets are also very recent, is that make them partners in progress, behavioral, sort of incentivize them to do the right thing. Doing well by doing good. It may sound like a motherhood statement, but these are being tried. There are countries across the world that are trying behavioral changes so that, make them partners. Tell them that this is the right thing. If you pay your taxes, it's good for the country because then we can use the money to develop, right? It's good to do that, right? So this behavioral approach is also, in addition to the carrots and sticks, a behavioral approach is also being tried. But I agree with the premise of your statement that structural remedies cannot be long-lasting in the digital space because of the profound network effects that I've been talking about. And in fact, it was suggested with Alphabet also, and it hasn't happened. It was suggested with Microsoft also. It didn't happen. AT&T happened in 1984, the new US Telecommunications Act, but Verizon today is as big as AT&T ever was. Yeah.
Sir, but as a regulator means, like talking about Flipkart, it has a status of a startup for like 9 to 10 years, and then they sold out. So does government should not look into it that they have access for the startup policies and all, and they are selling themselves up to?
So,
It's the same brain drain effect.
Absolutely. So what happened in the Walmart Flipkart case is that the Competition Commission, you have to apply to the Competition Commission of India for merger approvals or for acquisition approvals, and they went through the hoops and they decided that Walmart wasn't in India. They came, I mean, they were in the B2B business. They came in, bought, and they decided that there will be no additional damage to competition if Walmart buys out Flipkart. Now, if Amazon wants to buy out Flipkart or that is already existing, then there will be different metrics that would be used to assess that merger. Vodafone and Idea merged, right? And they decided that it wouldn't harm competition. In fact, it might be better for competition. Otherwise, both Vodafone and Idea would sink under pressure from a new entrant. So it's better to have a stronger entity in the market that can withstand the competition of the incumbent. So, I mean, it's no one size fits all, right? You have to examine the local local context. But the important thing is, again, what I told Krishna and what I'm saying here, not telling Krishna, I don't want to be pompous, but what I'm basically saying is that you should look at the market, right? You be pro-market. If market competition survives, then that's what you should aim at. Because competition, as the cliche goes, is the best regulation. Sorry, I'm sort of out of the frame. Competition is the best regulation. Yeah. So sort of try and ensure that competition exists in the market.
So my point was to safeguard those startups, means from those giants and all.
Yeah, so that's sort of, again, when you acquire a startup, Flipkart wasn't a sort of a startup when it was acquired by Walmart, but there are startups, and that's exactly Raghu Ram Rajan's point, is that you create a kill zone by acquiring the startup and then putting that technology on the back burner because it affects the future of your business. Absolutely, those are the kind of startups, those should be preserved in the interest of technological progress and Schumpeterian competition, absolutely. But the point I'm making is, who's going to take that decision? Do you have the capacity
more regulation means, when we say more regulations, are we not moving towards China model of closed governance and all?
Minimum government, maximum governance. So no, we are not moving, and we'll never go down that route. We are not going to be able to go down that. I'm happy to have a bilateral conversation with you on this, but we are not going down that route. No, we are not.
If I can give you examples for why Tesla is not in India right now, means for companies, for outside companies and in wind energy also, there is a minimum requirement of product to be produced inside of the country.
Yes.
Then only you can be allowed to sell, means do your business inside the country. So because of this reason only, many countries they have to come here, build their factory and all, and then only they are allowed to do.
Absolutely. This is not the first time this is playing out in India. It's been with the semiconductor industry. It's played out 20 years ago when Intel asked for huge amounts of subsidy to produce in India. It's happened in the e-commerce business when companies said 30% local sourcing. Are 30% hai nahi? You don't have the local producers to give me 30%. How am I? IKEA said, how am I going to source 30% of my business locally when there are no local producers? So this is not the first time this is playing out in India, but this is very political driven, right? This is political economy playing itself out. There could be two things happening here. I don't know the answer. One could be a pushback from the existing lobbies to keep Tesla out because they are existing producers who were doing electric car manufacturing, to keep them out, and they obviously being, they would obviously have the ear of the government. The other hand, Tesla may be asking for too much. In the list of priorities of the government, government's cash always has competing objectives. As they say, should I buy kidney machines? Or should I support museums? Or should I support art? Should I invest in tourism? Where should I put my money in? Or should I just give out money on Narega? Because India has huge amounts of people who are unemployed. So where should I put money? Yeah. Pleasure.
Thank you. Is there any more question? No? So thank you, Dr. Kathuria. I think your years of experience and depth of understanding and the way you explain this complex topic, I think we are all going to go back and look up in the books and the journal papers that you have mentioned to find answers of some of the questions. I know we'll not get the full answer, but at least probably we'll get more questions. We'll come back to you.
Sure.
Again,
Pleasure.
get some insights. Thank you so much. Thank you all. And as you mentioned, there's no free lunch. You all have earned your lunch. Lunch is served outside. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.